Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hello everyone, welcome to an in-between-isode where I answer any question that you have for me about history. Today's question is this: who do you think is the bravest person in history? Well, this is a completely subjective and totally arbitrary question, but I'm going to take a stab at it and put forward my vote. I vote for James Holman. Sure, you've never heard of him. James Holman was a British naval officer in the early 1800s, and he happened to be the person who traveled further than anyone else in history on foot, on cart, and in sail before the age of steamship, and definitely before the age of air travel, when travel was easier. James Holman traveled 250,000 miles on foot. That is about 18 or 20 times farther than Marco Polo ever went, and that's about 10 times farther than Ibn Battuta. He was an Islamic explorer in the 1300s who started in North Africa, went to China, went to India, and everywhere else in between. Here's why I think James Holman is the bravest person who ever lived. It's not because he traveled to all these different places. It's not because he went into the cannibal-infested jungles of Africa, he went to the Australian outback, or he went into the gold mines of Brazil. The reason I think he's the bravest man in history is because he did all of these things even though he was completely blind. I know about the life of James Holman thanks to a fantastic book by Jason Roberts called A Sense of the World, and I think I'd like to have Jason on the podcast to talk more about James Holman because it's really one of my favorite books. But let me tell you just a little bit about him. So James Holman was born in, I think, the 1780s, and he entered the British Naval Service at the age of 12. By all accounts, he was a healthy lad and did well at sea. He served for about 10 years in the North Atlantic in the frigid waters and doing different patrols of the Canadian coast during the Napoleonic Wars. Sometime around his mid-20s, he came down with rheumatism and started feeling pain in his joints. It wasn't too much of a problem until one day he felt pain in the back of his eyes. He went to convalesce in mineral baths, but one day woke up and found that he was completely blind. Now, blindness in the early 1800s was a scary prospect. Oftentimes, you would live with your family, but you would never venture outside. They were ashamed of you. They figured that you had done something to call upon a curse from God. Other times, you'd be taken to begging, and you'd have to tie a rag around your eyes so that people wouldn't look at their wandering eyes. Oftentimes, people in towns would collect all the blind around them. They would dress them up in ridiculous clothing, mismatching shoes, ridiculous hats, as if people stumbled out of their bed that day, and they would parade the blind around the town square to laugh at them and mock at them. Well, James Holman refused to be an object of pity or scorn. He decided that he was still going to retain his dignity, and he would walk around England in his naval uniform with a gentleman's walking stick in hand. But he didn't just want to keep his dignity, he wanted to be able to get around on his own. He developed a method where he put a metal end on his walking stick and would strike it hard on the ground when he went. This would create a sharp noise and allow an echo to go out so that it would bounce off of walls, it would bounce off of horse carriages, it would come back to him and he would get a flash of sensation of what was going on. Basically, he was training himself to see the world through a rudimentary form of echolocation, to see the world the way a dolphin or a bat would. Well, he really succeeded. After a few months of this, he could walk down the street and sense if a man or a woman were approaching him based off of their gait and their footwear, and he would be able to doff his hat to a woman at the right time. He got so good after several more months that he could enter a crowded restaurant, know that a friend of his was on the other end of it, even if it was completely noisy based on the sound of his voice, and he could walk and maneuver between tables. Well, it wasn't enough for Holman now to understand the world. He wanted to experience the world. The Navy ordered that he recuperate in the warm waters of the southern Mediterranean in France, and he gladly said yes. His brother wanted to travel with him, but Holman said no. The blind traveler was going to go abroad by himself. Holman's first experience abroad was in France, and you have to understand that France back then was not the tourist paradise the way it is today. Between towns, you could be robbed by a highwayman or a bandit, and it was more like traveling through rural Afghanistan than it was today. But his problems weren't so much the danger, it was other passengers. When he was going through France, he'd be crammed into a cart with other passengers, and they wouldn't talk to him. They would assume that a blind man was ignorant or intellectually impaired. At one point, when they were crossing a river, other passengers got out, didn't say a word to Holman, and they went into a passenger ferry, but they left Holman with the baggage, and that's what he was treated like a piece of baggage on a cargo ship. He decided, as a blind man, that he needed to assert himself as much as possible. He would jump into other people's conversations, he would use whatever bits and pieces of language he knew, and he would even invite himself over to other people's houses. Well, people were not put off by this. They were, in fact, charmed by it. He managed to join a traveling company that were going to Mount Vesuvius in Italy. This was right when the mountain was about to undergo a volcanic eruption. Other members of the traveling party were nervous about the shaking ground, but Holman had his walking stick and he was able to determine sure footing and where to put one foot in front of the other, and had no problems going up the volcano. When they got near the top, others were scared to go around the rim of the volcano, and also the ash was so thick that nobody could see, but for Holman, it was no problem at all. He became the first blind man to summit Mount Vesuvius, and he returned to England and wrote a travel account. It was a bestseller, and now he was a minor celebrity. Now, there were detractors who said that the blind can't properly appreciate foreign culture. Proper understanding of aesthetic beauty comes from sight. If all you rely on are your ears or your nose, then what can you determine but sharp clanging or putrid odors coming out? But in order to silence his critics, Holman decided he'd travel further than anyone else ever done, and he was going to be the first person to do a solo circumnavigation of the globe on foot. His first attempt was to cross Russia, which he actually got 3/4 of the way across the Russian continent on a sledge, on a little cart hauled by someone and their horse who didn't speak the same language that Holman did, and he got all the way to the Mongolian city of Irkutsk before agents of the Russian Tsar captured him, thinking he was an English spy, and deported him. In his second attempt to circumnavigate the globe, Holman thought that he would go on ship. Whenever he would board a ship, to prove that he was competent, he had a little trick where he would climb to the top of the crow's nest, the very top of the ship, and show people that he was perfectly able to handle himself at sea. Well, Holman made it to the malaria-infested jungles of Equatorial Guinea. Then he went to Brazil, where he went deep into the interior in the mountains and went to gold mines. He went to South Africa, where he was able to go into cannibal-infested jungle. Then he went into Australia, and he went to explore parts of the outback that were uncharted. Finally made it back to Brazil, then up to England, and he succeeded in being the first man to circumnavigate the globe. Now, you would think he would be famous at this point, but his detractors kept trying to look at something wrong with his writings, and they found out that he committed numerous factual errors, which was common at the time because you had to rely on a lot of secondhand accounts. People began to distrust him, and as a result, his book sales plummeted. His book sales plummeted so much that he wasn't able to get his most recent travel accounts published. Holman was now an old man at this point, and he began to write his autobiography. Shortly before his death, he finished it, and he gave his manuscript to a friend as his literary executor to get it published, but his friend failed to do so. The book was never published, and unfortunately, the manuscript was lost. Now, that doesn't come to the end of the story for James Holman. In recent years, many blind people have rediscovered his methods of echolocation and are starting to use it to get a sense of the world. Moreover, scholars have rediscovered his story, and they're fascinated by how somebody could do as much as he did. I have a theory on how he was able to get a sense of the world and overcome his blindness. I don't know if this is true or not, but if you are a shipman, especially in the days of sailing ships, you had to know exactly where everything was on that ship. In the midst of a storm, in the midst of black thunderclouds, in the middle of the night where you couldn't see what was going on, you had to know where rope was, where different implements were, be able to secure things down. There was a place for everything and everything in its place, and you had to be confident that you could operate when you could not see. So that initial bit of confidence, I think, gave to Holman an understanding that he could overcome problems as long as he set up patterns for himself and understood how to get in, and he knew that he could operate in a small domain on a ship. It was just a matter of expanding that domain out. Well, he did expand that domain out, and he expanded it until it covered the entire world. Well, that's my summary. Check out the book A Sense of the World. It is a fascinating book. I can't recommend it highly enough. And if you'd like to shoot another question to me, go to historyunpluggedpodcast.com. Send me a question. There are instructions there on how to do it, and I will be glad to answer them. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get your daily dose of all things history related, from ancient Greece to the Cold War. You can do that by going to historyonthenet.com/subscribe. Speaking of history on the net, if you want to dive deeper, go to our site historyonthenet.com, and there you'll find blog posts, book reviews, and all of our other podcast episodes. Plus, don't forget to rate and review this podcast so we can bring you the best daily history content possible. We'll see you next time at the History Unplugged podcast.